Welcome everyone, this is Norman Gilliland. I'm Andrew Sewell. Norman.
Andrew.
How are you?
I'm doing well.
It's great to be here.
Yes, it is great to be anywhere, but here in particular, and looking forward to a season.
Yes, indeed. Well, we're here confined at the WCO offices on East Main Street here in Madison. We're here to talk a little bit about the upcoming season of the Masterworks season, which we're shortly to announce.
And more good stuff.
Exactly. But just one quick thing is that the season itself has been somewhat, we're in this pandemic, so obviously everything's a little
improvised and a little
very much so. We have to be very fleet-footed because, as we've just seen in the last several days, circumstances can change on a dime as to what we're allowed and what we're not allowed. But quintessentially, though, we are planning our season as we have, and so we're looking forward to it. We hope that the audience will be back in time when we open on November the 20th with John O'Connor.
And Beethoven, 5 was a good number for Beethoven.
Exactly.
From our standpoint.
Mm-hmm.
Of course, the Fifth Symphony, but in this case, the fifth of his 5 piano concertos.
Mm-hmm.
The most famous of the 5, one of the most famous of all piano concertos, justifiably.
So tell me, where did he get the name, the Emperor?
Oh, I think that had to have been a publisher. I can't imagine Beethoven himself putting it on there. And, it was a
Being
time.
the Republican that he was, not modern-day Republican, but,
But I think, given that it's got this grandness and largeness to it, that's where the name comes from. And it was a time, as you know, where a lot of works like Haydn symphonies and Beethoven piano sonatas, the publishers were putting names on, like,
those publishers,
Moonlight as an afterthought for sure, and that kind of thing.
Yeah, well, I do know the Miracle by Haydn was because of that chandelier.
Which had
nothing to do with the symphony.
happened in another symphony. That's right. Yes.
Well, that's for another day.
Sloppy back then.
That's true.
But this one fits, I think.
Yeah. So speaking about on the program, that's going to be in the second half, and we're opening with 2 interesting pieces: a chamber work by Stravinsky, his septet, followed by a Cherubini symphony, Luigi Cherubini, who's most notable for being an opera composer, which is why I chose that. Now, obviously everybody knows Beethoven, so my 3-finger plan is, something very familiar, something less familiar, and something completely unfamiliar. That's kind of how it's working. And in this case, the most unfamiliar would be, I think, the Cherubini symphony.
For sure. But what's interesting about Cherubini is, among other things, he was one of the major composers of the time, very successful, also had the blessing of a long and productive life, well into the 19th century. And a couple of things. One is he actually did influence Beethoven in some ways, with some of his overtures kind of leach into Beethoven in places. And we know that Beethoven had scores of fellow composers, their works. But also it gives you an idea, this symphony, of what composers other than Beethoven were writing in those early years of the 19th century.
Yeah, I know we really kind of almost silo the composers, don't we? We think that there was only one composer living around Beethoven, that was Beethoven, because he's so famous. And I agree, I think there are many of his contemporaries, which we've explored with the Chamber Orchestra to a lesser degree. For example, Hummel, we performed his piano concertos recently, in the last 10 years. John Field was another one that sort of got overshadowed by Chopin. But anyway, and tell us a little bit about the septet and the Stravinsky septet.
Stravinsky was endlessly inventive, There's a wonderful story about Nadia Boulanger, who was a friend or mentor of practically any composer you can think of in the first half of the 20th century. And Stravinsky constantly sent her manuscripts, his latest work, and she said at one point to a visitor, "Well, I don't have time to even look at them all." So he was just constantly inventing, and I think he was one of those composers who, maybe a little like Prokofiev, just wrote constantly. Whether he didn't wait for the muse, to strike. He wrote, and then you see what comes out of it. But it's all Stravinsky, and it's all intelligent.
That's amazing.
And it's sometimes more challenging for the audience and sometimes less.
Yes. Well, we recently did the Soldier's Tale not so long ago, and that kind of, in terms of my thinking, kind of opened up the Pandora's box, so to speak, of his chamber works. Because, I mean, obviously, as a chamber orchestra, the repertoire of music available to us is anything pre-Romantic, the large orchestra, and then kind of post 20th century and early 20th century, when right after World War I they were returning to a much more economic way of writing.
Scaled down.
Scaled down.
They had to because of the available resources.
Yeah.
Both for performers and audiences.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and it does take, the thing about Stravinsky though is so recognizable. I mean, it's distinctive.
Yes. And
he influenced so many other people. In fact, we'll move on because we're speaking about the Stravinsky, another Russian composer that was contemporary of a little younger, of course, was Kabalevsky.
Yes, and a charming composer. I discovered Kabalevsky, as I suppose a lot of people have, as a very, very struggling piano student, back in my childhood. And he wrote a lot of charming little off-kilter pieces.
Yes.
From if you're thinking in terms of, Diabelli or the other kinds of things that young piano students would take on first, Stravinsky had these wonderful, Kabalevsky, perhaps inspired by Stravinsky, had these wonderfully, as I say, kind of off-center ways of writing things. It's lovely stuff. But he also wrote with young performers in mind. He wrote 3 youth concertos, one for piano, one for violin, and this one for cello. Well,
they aren't youth concertos, as we discovered this year. So
no, they're not for children to play, except very, very talented children.
But unfortunately, that's exactly why this past season we performed the Kabalevsky concerto with Jura Schmidt, to actually prove the point that these are not juvenile youth concertos. I mean, even though every young violinist will play it, it's a very challenging piece and beautifully orchestrated. So we're now talking about the second Masterworks concert, which is going to feature Amit Palad on June the 15th, January 15th, of 2021. Amit Palad, our soloist, cellist, is going to be performing the Kabalevsky Cello Concerto, number 1, and also an Offenbach Andante. I'd originally thought that might be a nice encore, but as we discovered this year with the Kabalevsky, because of the shortness of the work, it lends itself to having an additional piece and something that perhaps would not ordinarily you'd see or find on a concert. And there are many pieces that fall into this category of 8 minutes, 6 minutes, 8 minutes, 10 minutes long that you
Too
never
long for
see.
An encore, but it's nice.
And you just never see on a program.
Like these youth concertos.
And I often wonder, what was the occasion that these pieces were written? For example, this Offenbach Andante, I heard on your program, as I often do, and it's one of those pieces that you slip in just before the news or something. But beautiful. Obviously, Offenbach was an opera composer, most famous for his overtures and things.
Sure, but he wrote, as it turns out, at least several works for cello. Shortish works like this, and of course, as an operetta composer or opera composer, he had a gift for song, for melody.
Absolutely.
It comes out in these short pieces.
Well, I was going to say, when we performed the Offenbach Orpheus in the Underworld recently in the last season, another thing that came to mind was in that style, along with von Suppé, that kind of 19th century, mid-19th century operetta, light opera, if you like, operatic overture, they often singled out the solo violin, the solo cello, and maybe an oboe or a clarinet as like the singer song,
good point.
followed by something a little more genteel, or even the harp, for example. So that'll be interesting. This particular program, I enjoyed putting this together, and you'll see that the second half it features the Dvorak Wind Serenade, which actually includes cellos and violas. Cellos and bass, and no upper strings.
Mm-hmm.
And that is not often performed, I mean, aside from the famous string serenade.
Yeah, of course, because Dvorak's interesting that way because he wrote 2 serenades. One Opus 22 just for strings, one Opus 44 just for winds.
That's right.
You're enhancing this a little bit.
Yes, yes. Well,
it'll be a lovely combination.
yes, very nice. And then we finish with Mozart's Symphony Number 34 in C, which is a particular favourite of mine. It only has 3 movements, so it's a little on the shorter side. Again, a piece that sometimes is difficult to program. Often, not too many short Mozart symphonies. 38 is another example. Yeah. Where you might play at the very beginning of a concert as like an overture. In this case, it's going to follow the Dvorak. And last but not least, we are opening the concert with a work by
to New Zealand.
A very good friend of mine, Christopher Blake. He just recently retired as the CEO of the New Zealand Symphony Orchestra earlier this year. He's a composer that I met in my very first job as a young violinist in Auckland, where he was the general manager of the then Auckland Regional Orchestra, now named the Auckland Philharmonic Orchestra. And he is, in his own right, a well-known and storied New Zealand composer. And this work is actually part of a group of 4 pieces that he went on to write. Initially, at my behest, I had asked him to write a piece based upon the last segment of a work that he had written back in the 90s called We All Fall Down, incidentally taken from the Ring a Ring a Rosie,
A
Pocket Full of Posies, Tissue All Fall Down, from the play.
Yes, the old play.
And so, in fact, this was written in the 90s during the Bosnian conflict, and this was his tribute to those fallen children in war. And so I was at the premiere, and this very haunting melody really got my imagination. So I just wrote to him and said, Chris, would you write a piece based upon that last little segment? So he came up with this piece called An Angel at Ahipara and wrote the piece. We premiered it with the Wisconsin Chamber Orchestra back in the early O's. And he then went on to write another 3 pieces and has actually recorded it. It's a whole hour long. So this is the second of those pieces, which I wanted to bring back. So it's called Night Journey to Parapawarenga. Parapawarenga. In Māori, all the vowels are even, A-E-I-O-U. So Pawarenga. So.
Well, you've had more time to practice tonight.
Okay. Boy, we're taking a long time on this.
It looks intriguing, though, with a bit of a mystique to it.
Yes. In fact, if you were to ask me about his style, it would remind one perhaps of Arvo Pärt at certain times.
Of course,
other times,
very popular stuff. Yeah.
Other times, almost like the Scandinavian. When New Zealand somehow has a sort of affinity with Finland and the Scandinavian countries, incidentally, but a lot of for example, Douglas Lilburn, who we've heard before, often, as I'm told, sounds like Sibelius or Vaughan Williams and has that kind of duality. So Chris Blake is no exception.
So that's the second concert.
Yeah.
January 15th. And by February 19th, Alexander Sitkovetsky is back.
Yes, our Masterworks 3 program. So Sasha is coming back. I think this is his 3rd or 4th time with us. We first performed together out in Monterey in 2009. And we did then the Paganini. And in fact, we were hoping he would come back and play the Paganini. But for one reason or another, that piece got performed by a different violinist. So he's coming back to perform the Vivaldi 4 Seasons with us. And when I suggested that piece, he immediately said, well, let's do the Piazzolla as well.
Yeah, they're paired occasionally these days. Yeah,
they are.
It makes a fascinating comparison because Piazzolla, sort of a south of the equator 4 Seasons. And of course, he's very well aware of the Vivaldi Piazzolla when he writes those.
So perhaps you can tell the audience just a little bit about the music, because as I've listened to it, he paraphrases and weaves in the Vivaldi into his music, and then of course he goes off into his typically Astor Piazzolla style. I mean, you just can imagine a bandoneon kind of playing there, but it's very energetic. It's got all the same energy as the 4 Seasons, and I'm actually very, very excited to hear it.
The rhythms compare, because with Piazzolla we always think of the tango rhythms and the South American cabaret sound of the 30s and that kind of thing.
No question. He does put in those distinctly how would you say this, Piazzolian?
So, yeah, works for me.
You know, with the little gritty thing that you often get in his quintets and things. I mean, there are certainly string techniques that he incorporates, but certainly the string writing is very unique and very tasteful, and I really enjoy that. And it's actually an all-strings program. We're going to open with the Janáček Suite for Strings from 1877. You know, one of the wonderful discoveries over the years have been sort of a personal journey for me, has been to try and discover and play and perform as many string orchestra pieces, aside from the famous ones, the Elgars, the Tchaikovskys, the Dvoraks, and actually find these pieces that we just don't hear. Recently we did the Suk Serenade.
Right, yes. Yeah. Also,
and, you know, we often hear Janáček, we hear about the Sinfonietta, which is this...
One of the last things he wrote, whereas this is one of the first.
Thank you, yes, absolutely.
It was all of 23 when he wrote it.
And I guess when I heard it, I was intrigued. I didn't know who the composer was, and I was quite surprised. So he sort of sounds a little bit like Dvorak at times. Other times, distinctly, you know, his roots Czech. That was a moment.
Janáček checking in now.
Yeah. So we go on to the fourth one?
Yes, and we can proceed then to March 19th, and guitar concerto, and actually it was
I'm just checking my email. Oh, this one coming in.
Spanish accents in this concert galore.
Oh my gosh. So, Norman, I wanted to do this program for quite some time. And this came out of a program that I was scheduled to conduct in Hong Kong which I did last November. However, I was very, very excited because I've known about the Manuel Ponce guitar concerto for a long time, and like my other kind of little private sort of detective stories, I've tried to find as many guitar concertos as I can, and we've pretty much
some good ones.
We've done a lot of them, frankly. There aren't, but the main ones is what everybody likes to hear, the familiar.
Yes.
This one is a piece that would be familiar in style, and really it deserves a lot more airplay. And first of all, I was supposed to schedule to do it with Sharon Isbin in Hong Kong, but she wanted to do something else, and so we acquiesced, of course, and that was last year. So, but that got me thinking about it, and the other piece that I did in Hong Kong was this Halfter piece.
It's the Halfter, yes. Halfter.
Now, he is a protege of Ernesto Halfter, was a protege of Manuel de Falla.
Wow.
A lot of Manuels floating around. And he actually, upon de Falla's death, wrote a lot of his music posthumously and went about cataloguing all of his music. He was his mentor. But in his own right, he was a very fine composer.
Yes.
So this Sinfonietta is actually very much in the style of Stravinsky. So earlier on, we're talking about the septet and Stravinsky style. He is very much influenced. So if I was to describe the style of this Sinfonietta, Pulcinella comes to mind.
Oh, okay.
And in fact, there are almost such strong similarities, not only in the style and the number of movements, but just in the orchestration. It's single each woodwind, two horns, one trombone, one trumpet, and then strings.
Well, we said at the beginning that Stravinsky was influential, and it's
so
very
many
likely
levels
that he influenced this. But when you say Pulcinella, then I think, and Stravinsky, of course, I think of melodic but jaunty.
Yes, true. And always harking back to those Baroque forms.
Yeah.
And similarly, of course, Mabel de Falla was in Paris for some time and probably would have met Stravinsky. All those guys are around in the teens and the 20s of the last century. And then we're opening with a piece called by Arriaga, his Los Esclavos. I'm not going to even try and pronounce that.
Happy Slaves.
Yeah, what's that?
The Happy Slaves.
The Happy Slaves. Tell us a little bit about that overture.
Well, it's to an opera, and we're talking about a composer. He's known as the Spanish Mozart, Arriaga. He was born on the 50th anniversary of Mozart's birth. And like Mozart and then some, died young, which is to say he was just 20 years old. and this would have been in 1826.
Oh my gosh.
And to have this much wonderful music to his credit, and I can never remember if he died 10 days before or after his 20th birthday.
Oh my gosh.
But very short life, but lovely, charming stuff. And Los Esclavos Felices was an opera that he actually wrote. And you know, it takes a while to write an opera.
Was he a protege?
Well, not of Mozart. I mean, he certainly would have known about Mozart. I'm trying to think of what tradition he would have come out of. Solidly, you know, classical stuff. Mm-hmm. But it has a bit of that kind of Spanish note to it also. Mm.
Yeah, I came across it too, just hearing it again on the radio, thinking that's a cool piece. I didn't know that one. What's this? And I squirrel it away in my little file, you know, write it on my hand. You know. Anyway, that fitted beautifully into this sort of Spanish idea. Now, the soloist, I must talk about Mabel Millar. So, in fact, when we were, again, scheduling to do the Pensée, and initially when there was some concern about whether this guitarist, she pops up on YouTube as the person that's played this mostly. She's Spanish, young Spanish guitarist, has a great website and has actually got this piece recorded. And so I thought, well, my colleague in Hong Kong, Leanne Nichols, had already made some sort of connections there, and I thought, well, wouldn't it be great to introduce a new guitarist to Wisconsin audiences? So we're very excited about her coming.
And the fascinating thing about guitar concertos is that there's sort of a gap there, because you have, you know, Baroque guitar concerto, Vivaldi, although lute in his case, but so often played by guitars. And then you have composers like Giuliani and Sohr early in the 19th century with guitar, bringing it into the classical repertoire. There's this long gap. And I think part of the reason for that is, how do you get the guitar to be audible with a 20th century, 21st century concert hall and orchestra?
Yeah, it almost followed the route of the harpsichord, didn't it? I mean, almost went into
hibernation for a long time as a you know, concerto instrument.
Right, until Rodrigo really became popular, and and of course Segovia, and then some.
Yeah, it came back.
There are a lot of guitarists that are commissioning pieces, and of course there's always a balance issue, and in fact most guitarists use an amplifier. They all do, and it's, I mean, we don't seem to have that problem with violins though.
No, isn't that interesting? Yeah, which is a smaller instrument. How do they do that? Mm-hmm. Something to do with technique, but charming stuff, and also kind of nice things to explore, those 20th century guitar concertos. Yes,
indeed. So I think, shall we go on to the last? Masterworks 5?
The last of the Masterworks per se.
Yes.
Brings us back to Ludwig van Beethoven.
Right. So Michael Mizrahi is the piano professor at Lawrence, and is a concerto soloist in his own right. He's performed twice with us before with the Chamber Orchestra at Concerts on the Square, big concertos, and I've often wanted to have him come back and perform indoors, so this is a great opportunity. I asked him, what would you like to play? And he said, I'd love to do Beethoven Piano Concerto No. 1. So there we are. We're actually opening the season with his 5th and closing the season with his 1st. So sort of...
Yeah, bookending the 5 piano concertos. Now, a quick word about the orchestra in Beethoven's time. Roughly the size of the Wisconsin Chamber Orchestra?
Yes, indeed. Every concerto, in fact, most of his symphonies had double woodwinds, then 2 horns and 2 trumpets, with the exception of the Eroica, which had 3 horns, and Beethoven 9, which had trombones to boot, and a contra and a piccolo for the big choral.
Few singers thrown in.
But you know, there are 8 symphonies, and then there's a 9. So, but the piano concerto, yes, and in fact, chronologically, it's actually his 2nd. So the B flat number 2 is chronologically his 1st, but as we know, things get a bit messed up, a little bit like Mendelssohn, you know.
Yeah, it's pretty common.
And so actually, it's a lovely concerto, and the key, that's going to be in the first half, and then to end the season, the Brahms Serenade has always intrigued me. He wrote 2 serenades as kind of audition pieces, if you like. He wanted to get his chops up as a orchestral, as a symphonist. We know that he wrote so much piano music and everything else, but he was a highly self-critical.
Yes, and it really took him a long time to work up to a symphony, or even a piano concerto for that matter.
So these were kind of his tryouts, if you like. But of course, being a serenade, there are multiple movements, at least, 7 movements. But in fact, the serenade as a traditional piece, as we know of Mozart, Cassations, Serenade, Divertimenti, were intended to be pieces that would take up an entire evening. And so there really isn't a protocol. I mean, if we were to play the entire serenade, it would be 45 minutes. And each is self-contained. There's no real relationships between, it's not like a symphony where, you might recall the theme from the first movement and stick it in the last movement. No, these are all separate. So that has given me pause to think about how would the audience like to respond to this. So I've got this idea of playing a movement or 2 as a little overture, kind of to tease the audience. Play the Beethoven concerto, and then come back and finish the job with the rest of the serenade.
That's not out of keeping with performance practice in Beethoven's time, where you would hear the first movement of a symphony, and then there would be maybe a violinist come out and
cheese and crackers.
Yeah, play trick pieces,
Right.
novelty items, and you get to the second movement of the symphony. It was all it was more of a, as you say, a diversion, that would go on for much of the night. These things were not thought of quite so much as unified pieces, at least in those early performances.
Yeah, we're very structured now, aren't we?
We are. Yeah.
And it was a very social event. I mean, I keep thinking about the types of audience that were there. They were really there to see their friends and pick up the store.
To be seen.
Yeah, true.
Seen.
Yeah,
yes, that's right.
I guess those social occasions. And here we are now, back to square one, talking about the indoor season. Before we go, I want to mention that we have actually added a Masterworks program from this current season and tacked it on to next year. So on May the 14th, we are having a postponed concert of Yolanda Condonasis from March 28th of 2020.
Wonderful harpist.
Absolutely. So she's going to perform the Ginastera Harp Concerto, and we're also performing Prokofiev's Sinfonietta, which is the piece prior to the Ginastera, and finishing it with Haydn's Symphony No. 88. So that's already been game, set, match, so to speak. Tell us a little bit about the Ginastera and Yolanda.
Well, Yolanda is one of the best known and most recorded harpists around today. Charming person. I checked the record before we came in here. I knew I had interviewed her once before, but I had no idea that it was 12 years ago.
Was she here?
She was here to perform, yes. Probably with the Madison Symphony.
Okay.
I can't remember for sure, it's been that long. But the Ginastera is another, I'd call it kind of a rarity on concert programs, but a great addition to the harp repertory. Yeah. And a composer who's hard for me to categorize, South American, yes.
But incredibly ingenious.
Heritage, but a real unique.
Very experiential, and he wrote it for the famous Spanish harpist Nicola Zabaleta. I had the opportunity to hear one of his last performances in Mexico City when he performed the Ginastera, which was his piece. Interestingly, from birth to conception and then to actual performing, it took 9 years. He had originally had it recorded, commissioned, and then it went in a strange way somewhere else, and another harpist, Zabaleta ended up at the time getting the piece performed. But when I was researching this, it was 1965, I think, was when it finally got written, although it was performed, but it was actually written in the late 50s.
And so you have all kinds of things coming together. I mean, when you say the late 50s, what kind of music would we expect? Could be almost anything.
Well, at the time, and certainly in the mid-century of the 20th century, everything was very experiential. If you were thinking about in the academic scene,
yes.
Anyone that was a professor and working you know, at the time, that's how you'd make it a living as a full-time composer, was you'd teach and be affiliated with a conservatory. There were no freelancing composers around. I mean, think about even Aaron Copland. But those freelance composers tended to be less restricted by convention.
Yeah.
And so you see these guys really getting out there and experimenting with a lot of stuff. So actually, when you hear that harp concerto, she does all sorts of tapping, knocking, and this amazing a technique with the harp where she flicks down the string and it makes a kind of a whoosh sound.
Yeah, that's true. There are a lot of special effects in there.
And of course, it's with the 7 pedals. And I performed this piece with her recently, so I'm speaking from experience. But her the cadenza that Ginastera wrote is incredibly unique, and he really explores every nook and cranny of the harp and brings in every little technique that you can do, and it's always quite a talking point at pre-concert talks.
Well, there you go. And it makes an instrument that too often is almost lost in the orchestra, and brings it front and center.
Yes.
And shows you how versatile that instrument can be.
And it's interesting, you know, I've worked with harpists, and depending on what side of they like to put their head, it's traditionally on the left-hand side. So, no, maybe I can't even remember. All I know is that she likes to be on the cello side, so she can see. I just did another piece with a harpist, my own harpist, and we had this conversation. It just depends, and of course the angle of the harp has to be pushed out to the audience and things. It is very interesting. The harp is a unique instrument, and I'm happy to be working with Yolanda again. Yes. I'm so glad that we're able to get that concert in May the 14th.
To look forward.
Well, Norman, this has been a great fireside chat without the fire.
Yes, that's right.
It's always great to have you.
Virtual fire.
Yeah, we can sort of shake virtually. And thank you for being part of this, conversation, introducing our new season as we're about to launch it. In these tough times, it's great to have a familiar face and colleague to share your insights, as always.
My pleasure. We'll look forward to seeing some familiar faces out in the audience, too.
Thank you.